people of the United States. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Hello, and welcome to George Washington Slept Here, the civic education podcast from Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, where we explore American history, civics, and the idea of liberty through conversations with some of our favorite thinkers, writers, and leaders. I'm Jason Raia, Chief Operating Officer at Freedom's Foundation and host of George Washington Slept Here. The format is simple, a long-form conversation with a friend of Freedom's Foundation where everyone can learn something new. Before we go any further, a little housekeeping. We encourage everyone to subscribe to George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure you get every new episode as soon as it is out. We love hearing from our listeners, so please email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or suggestions, and follow us on social media at FFVF on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram at Freedom's Foundation. Today's interview is Steve Edenbo of American Historical Theater, where he interprets Thomas Jefferson. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Jason.
Our conversation today is going to be structured in a way to keep us on track. As it always is, we want to explore your origin story. How did you become the person sitting here before us? Your current work as Thomas Jefferson. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the state of America today. And finally, we will end with a quiz where hopefully listeners will learn something about you that they did not know before the quiz. So tell us, where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in western Pennsylvania in Whiskey Rebellion country in Westmoreland County.
Okay.
So my parents are both from there, and then we moved to North Carolina for a little while. My father was following work. When I was 4, we moved back to Pennsylvania, to central Pennsylvania in Cumberland County, and that's where I grew up.
Okay, great. So mostly Pennsylvania with a sojourn down south in
I don't
North
remember
Carolina.
much of it, but apparently when I came back, originally I had a very thick Southern accent.
Oh, I love it. So that's why the
4
Thomas
years old,
Jefferson thing is
You know,
comes so naturally.
That may come from that. I sometimes worry I'm going to go too far with it, but apparently I wasn't worried about it when I was 4. It was quite wide open.
Okay. So who were your most important influences sort of growing up? And
I've had cause to reflect how lucky I was to have, just starting out early with a group of friends I met up with in high school who, having now over the years got more of an understanding of how eccentric I am. Look what I'm pursuing for a living, right? And they just accepted me for who I was, and they kind of helped me understand to some degree, and a minor degree that age, you know, how eccentric I was, but they just accepted me for who I was. It's the kind of thing when you see nostalgic movies and TV shows of those groups of friends. Well, I had that they just got to be themselves with each other. And over the years, I've also come to understand that not everybody gets to have that. They get to just, that was a privilege. It was Mark and Pat and Ed and John. I'll just do first names to protect the innocent and the guilty. But going on really formatively, I'll say, and this might seem like a cliche, but my parents, but in a very real way, again, over the years, understanding how lucky I was and am that I mentioned moving early, you know, when I was young, but then my parents made a very clear decision that they wanted to cultivate a stable environment for their children, for the family. Mm-hmm. And my father could have climbed the corporate ladder a lot more, and he made a conscious decision not to. He wanted to keep us in one place. And now I understand, an almost absurdly stable upbringing. It just doesn't happen.
Right.
One house, they still live in it. I went to college in the same town where I grew up, and that was also, I couldn't have done that. My parents, one of the greatest gifts they gave me was that stability of upbringing. Another one of the greatest gifts that they gave me was I graduated college without a college debt.
Ah, yes. So
And
that'll really allowed you to pursue.
I couldn't have. No, there's no way I would have pursued acting, and especially not the odd direction I went with it without. With a college debt, I would have. It would have been no chance.
Right,
No.
right. So yeah, what a gift! And
Absolutely.
So between those two things, your parents providing this stable family life and household, and the ability for you to graduate from college without debt, and then having this group of friends who allowed you to be you.
And you could repeat that story in college too. I had just so again, a group of people, I'm still friends with them, and they live in different parts of the world, and we stay in touch with letters and things, and just people who, it's amazing now I realize to have people, and my parents fit in that group too, who maybe they roll their eyes a little bit, but
they let you be you.
Yes, that's not as common as I used to take it for granted for being.
Yeah. So you mentioned college, Dickinson, if I remember correctly.
Yes, so I've had a connection with the founders, with Benjamin Rush and John Dickinson from earlier than I realized.
And remind everyone who John Dickinson is.
So John Dickinson, he's the namesake of Dickinson College, though it was founded by Benjamin Rush, but both are men who were in the Second Continental Congress. John Dickinson, more interestingly to some degree Rush fits in too, but John Dickinson more acutely to, I think, that sort of the ideas behind your podcast here. He famously, in the first musical about that era,
the great 1776,
right, opposed independence now. It wasn't that simplistic. He didn't oppose independence, but he just rightfully had very prudent reasons for thinking that we didn't have the resources, and he wouldn't vote for it, but he also recused himself, basically. He stepped out so that...
He wasn't going to be the impediment,
right,
but he was going to ask the hard questions.
Yeah.
But ultimately...
And he's a principled individual, and it wasn't that he wasn't going to be the impediment, just that. He knew we needed consensus. That the American Revolution was it's odd to use this term in this context, but it was a consensual process in many ways. And revolution, so we're talking firefights, declaration through constitution and establishment of the government. That's something that I think that we'll probably get to later in the way your podcast goes, but it wasn't just a simple majority. They were going to have a majority. Dickinson was going to be in the minority. He knew it, but he knew they needed consensus. Right. And that's why he stepped aside. But then he volunteered for the military, and he defended America. He and Jefferson were friends then.
And that's one of the things that I always find so interesting about the founders is they were not a monolith. They were disagreements, sometimes fundamental, and yet everybody contributed to the founding of this new nation in their own way. And sometimes it was by asking hard questions, realizing that I'm not going to come to agreement with this person, but then going off and joining George Washington in the army and contributing in a different way. It's unique in some way. The way they found their way around the obstacles, even when they themselves were the obstacle, they found a way to work to consensus and figure this out. But what did you study at Dickinson?
I was an English major. Mm-hmm. I almost minored in theater, but as one of Clint Eastwood's famous characters said many times, a man's got to know his limitations. And I fortunately realized that to do that kind of thing, you've got to have a talent for logistics, and I do not have that. So I made the choice, just one major, and I'm glad I did. But I definitely got sidetracked by theater.
Tell us about how you ultimately, once you graduate, how did you become involved with American Historical Theater? Tell us what American Historical Theater is.
That's a good place to start.
And then we'll go from there about how you ended up, in this career.
Sure. So American Historical Theater, the name is a little bit deceptive because it makes it sound like there's a brick and mortar theater building, and there's not. It's 100% outreach, I guess is a good way to put it, not-for-profit historical theater organization. It's been around now for over 30 years, founded by William and Pamela Summerfield. Bill Summerfield was the first person to officially portray George Washington for Mount Vernon and for the United States government. It was for the bicentennial of Washington's inauguration, and there was a national audition for it. Now, he passed away now over 10 years ago. Both Bill and Pam have passed away, but their theater company lives on, their legacy. And what we do is we've got a few score actors, a few dozen. It's a smaller number of actors, but over 100 different characters. We've got some amazing talents of people who, yes, they're actors. I will often use hyphenated actor-historian because I don't know of a better You can say first-person interpreter, but that's more confusing. Where they are actors. There's a lot of theater involved, but there's a continuum or seesaw, maybe relationship, if that could be a good image for it, between the actor and the historian. Whereas research is always preparation is part of any actor's role, the history here is these actors, they create, most of the time, they create their own scripts, and then they open up to question and answer, or even just improvisational visits where they are in character at a cocktail hour or something, and you're talking to these historical figures, and they chat with you. We try to stay out of modern day things, and though every one of our actor historians is a independent contractor, so we don't tell them what they have to do. But and we go all over the country, anything from schools to bar associations and CLEs to corporate functions to motivational speeches, pretty wide range, and community events, pretty wide range of events.
So I want to drill down on the difference between what an actor historian who is doing first-person interpretation, in other words, they are embodying a specific character. And it might be something as simple as colonial soldier, or something as complex as George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or for instance, Bessie Coleman. But, as opposed to acting where there is a script and you may be playing that character, but you're not, and to me, it's that word interpreting, that you are interpreting the character that you are playing. So how is it different?
With this odd duck of a sub-facet of theater that I often refer to it as a platypus. That we have this mixture, and a platypus, it's got the duck bill, but it's not waterfowl, but it has fur and it has a pouch. It's a marsupial, and it's got all these different things, but it's a unique animal. And you've got some of the actor, you've got some of the historian, you've got, in many cases, you have some of the preacher, and some of the. It's such a wide range. So when you take on a role and the role is written by someone, let's say Shakespeare, I mean, that's written in stone. That's a great example of an extreme. The script is your vehicle. Mm-hmm. And what you can get away with the script, and you can bend a little bit, that creates a tension that allows you this. If you have that tension and those boundaries around it, now you've got room to play because you've got the walls to bounce off of, and it creates that dramatic tension. And that's a key element of it. With this, yes, you'll have a script oftentimes. Some actors write their own scripts and stick to them more strictly, others more or less, depending. And I do more and less depending on my situation. But in this, so much of this, in its, I think maybe it's idealized is probably the wrong word, but in a form that is a model form of first-person interpretation, you can go off book and be perfectly comfortable. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, I resist situations that do not allow Q&A, off-book interaction with the audience, that unexpected element, because I feel like that best showcases what this is, where you immerse yourself in the information and the life, and you acknowledge the limitations of what we have on record and what we do not. And then you find ways to bolster that depending on how much is written about your historical figure. I call them characters, even though they're real people. People have said to me, "Oh, you're channeling Jefferson and you're embodying him." And I get a little bit. I try to be very careful. I've worked very hard over the last 23 years to not let it take over, because weirdly it can take over. And I think your life in a way that, especially with these better known prominent characters.
Sure.
And I've seen it happen. I won't name names, but I've seen it happen where you sort of lose who you are. You see the person losing who they are. Because we're doing this professionally, we have to be more outwardly focused toward the audience. Mm-hmm. So this digs in, I think, to circle back to the use of this term interpretation, and that, yes, I'm in character when I'm speaking to students, when I'm speaking to an audience. But I work very hard to be cognizant of, yes, I'm in character as Jefferson, I'm embodying Jefferson, but not to the point that I lose track of the context. Maybe a good way to contrast here is, because Oppenheimer right now, you can make that reference now. People know who he is because of the movie. There's no such thing as pure science, and there's no such thing as pure history, and Jefferson especially not. So there are things where I don't twist history. I won't change it to fit politics. I need to be cognizant that I'm not going to pretend as though there's pure history, that if I drop certain words, certain phrases, talk about certain things, that I'm somehow imagine that I'm disconnected from the current context of those things and where they are, how people respond to them, and in some ways how they can be abused. So I need to be cognizant of that. There's where interpretation comes in. Whereas with plays, let's say you've got Taming of the Shrew, it's really difficult. It's problematic. I hesitate to use the term, but it is there.
Sure,
right?
absolutely.
That maybe you cut a little bit, but you've still got the script there. Are you going to put it on or not?
Right.
It's problematic. You better wrestle with that. And so, and 1776 in some ways, people have recently wrestled with it. That you could have. There's a discussion to be had.
Absolutely.
The
latest.
It, or did they actually do the musical? Right.
Exactly. I saw the most recent Broadway production. And it was the gender flipped or all female cast. It really wasn't gender flipped because and I just felt like there was some interpretation going on by some of the actors. Rutledge was played as quite simply, two-dimensional evil. This is what came across to me, whether this was intended or not, was this was a slave owner, therefore he was a dastardly person, and that was the interpretation that
almost
came
twirled
through.
his mustache.
Yes, exactly,
right,
exactly. As opposed to a more nuanced, where you can still make that same, this is problematic, this is a slave owner, but let's try and, can we figure out what he is trying to deal with?
And it's presented in the script that they contextualize that
right
actually very effectively.
Well, and it's one of the things that we're going to get to in just 1 minute, because that's a big issue for you as Thomas Jefferson. But before we get there, I do want to ask you about your study. Because I remember when I first met you, you talked your way into a fellowship at Monticello in order to read Jefferson's letters firsthand and to imbibe that. I think you were there for like a month or something. And you and your colleagues at AHT do a lot more scholarly reading, I think, than people would believe, because it's not just about the script. It really is about understanding who this person was, but also that potential Q&A at the end where somebody can ask you a question. But tell me about what it took to learn who Jefferson was.
Well, first I'll say that my fellowship at the International Center for Jefferson Studies, and it was really thanks to Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy, who was in charge at the time, it was a career-changing, pivotal moment for me. And in some very big issues, I was able to really work through some things, test some things, and solidify a couple of very difficult things and get some context for things in just ways that would have been absolutely impossible since. And since I haven't published a book or anything, I can't credit them in it, but it's really a formative moment. But as far as the research and learning goes, it's constant. I mean, when I first started out, I knew, because I was an English major, I knew I had a lot of catching up to do. So I set myself a regimen where I had a notebook, a log of reading, and I set myself 5 hours of reading a day. And I did that for the first year, basically, a couple days here and there. I wouldn't be able to, obviously, but I kept that pretty, and I was reading Jefferson's biography, so I'm thinking, wow, he was reading, they say 12 hours a day while he was in college, so I can't do that. So 5, okay, maybe I can do 5. Now that wasn't guided. I didn't have the benefit of the guidance of if someone's working on their doctorate, that kind of a thing, right? So I didn't have that guidance, but over the years, it's been everything I can get between constant reading. Audiobooks have become more accessible now. Some amazing podcasts are out there as well as the continuing reading. Historical sites are amazing ways to do it. To go and you speak to people. Being in Philadelphia, having Independence National Historical Park has been, and my working with rangers and everyone and the people there has been an amazing resource. My fellow colleagues who do the first person interpretation, bouncing things off them, doing the research to write script. Different people do different levels of how much they research and they dive into it. For me, I have to occasionally back away because it gets to be too much. And again, back to what I said earlier, this can become overwhelming. You can kind of lose yourself in it.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we talk about the the 10,000 hours it takes to become. I mean, you did that in, you did 15,000 hours of reading in that first year.
I think 10,000 hours is not the road. That's not the amount of time it takes to achieve mastery. It's just where you get started.
Right. Right.
That's just enough to okay.
Yeah. That was your first year, and you've never stopped since then.
No, I haven't been able to do 5 hours reading a day. Sad, tragically. But I win the lottery. I'll get back to that.
But I do know that every new book that comes out, major book on Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I'm cramming those things into my head as best I can.
You were at Hamilton to see that version of Thomas Jefferson.
That's another
early
place.
on.
I was lucky with the people I had surrounded myself by. I know some people who, so now a number of them operate the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, which you'd think I wouldn't like them because of that. Right? You'd think, no, it's Team Jefferson. It's not like that, at least with us. And they were telling me, oh, you've got to see this musical. We've got early tickets for the first showing of it on Broadway, and it's this rap musical about Alexander Hamilton. I thought, that's going to be terrible.
Yeah.
That's going to be, it's going to be
I think
awful.
we all underestimated that.
And I said, okay, but you know what? This is my job. Okay. And there are other things going on at the time. It was the last thing I wanted to go do, but I went to go see it. And of course, in the 5 minutes, as they say, I was blown away.
Right.
And I'm so lucky that I was associated with people who pushed me in the right direction.
Yeah. So the biggest question of the day, why Thomas Jefferson? How did you land on you wanted to spend your professional career on the third president of the United States?
Well, again, other people sending things my way. I've been the recipient of people who have all along the way. It's always been people helping me and lifting me and supporting me along the way. And this is a case too where I didn't know this kind of work existed on this level. And it was the folks who were operating American Historical Theater. And at the time, it was the two founders of the company, Bill and Pam Summerfield, and Kim Hanley, who's now the executive director. And really, Kim saw me, and she's got this talent. Mm-hmm. She sees people and says, oh, that person can do this thing, and then that person could do that thing. And as far as finding talent, she saw early on, a few years after I'd started as Jefferson, she met Dean Melissa, who then eventually was to succeed Bill Summerfield at Mount Vernon as George Washington. And, Dean was doing regular acting work and obviously an immense talent. And Kim convinced Bill and Pam to meet with him and he should be Washington. And of course he was, right, to a great degree. And, Kim, and then she introduced me to Bill and Pam, and all of them said, you look like Thomas Jefferson. I said, I do. They said, you do. And they said, we need one, because in Philadelphia, yes, we go all over the country, but in Philly, there's a tourism industry, and so there's that kind of thing. And they said, we need one. And they gave me my first costume, my first books, and my first performance was at Independence National Historical Park, fittingly. And immediately, as I mentioned earlier with the metaphor, the platypus of the ability to do the deep dive in the reading and the writing and the thought, but then the ability to take that and put it on stage in dramatic form, that mixture. And then the travel part is absolutely a big part of what I saw that as an opportunity and definitely loved it. And all those things came together, and I never gave it a thought of, I was at a crossroads. It was a Yogi Berra, and when you come to a fork in the road, take it. I didn't even think it was such a perfect fit. Right. I took it off the rack and it fit. I just found this in the window and it.
Yeah. So
Carol Burnett,
So tell us, when you are Thomas Jefferson and you are with a group of students, with group teachers, with group lawyers, are there a couple of things that you want to communicate about Thomas Jefferson that if they leave the room knowing these 2 or 3 things, you feel like you've done your job?
Sure. First, I think one would be something that makes him look bad, but really doesn't, but kind of. 2 would be something that makes him look better, but not perfect. And then 3 would be something that makes him look just like us. And so the 1 would be, I always get worried if nobody asks about slavery. Mm-hmm. And now it's happening less, where I walk away where nobody did. The last 3 years, I'll say, which is a positive thing, because then we can have a conversation.
Right.
When people don't, I get where I want them to know that you not only can, but you need to ask about these difficult subjects when you're talking to the people who are situated to address them.
Mm-hmm.
And asking about the difficult subjects, talking about the difficult subjects is not the hurtful part. There's a way to do it that you're not doing damage, but you're also not sugarcoating. There's a way to do that. And Jefferson is, I think, the best situated of the most famous of the founders to nurture a conversation about that notion, specifically in his case, one of the issues about slavery. And that's such a big thing that I try to do. Now, the thing that's makes him look a little bit better in a complex way that I've been doing over the last few years more and more has been I've been focusing on his relationships. This idea we started with John Dickinson. And he's such an emblematic figure of that, but there's no current musical that puts him in the public eye that I can really talk about him. But I'll talk about John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and because of the Hamilton musical, I get to talk about Aaron Burr,
Right.
and his relationships with these people, and where he and they either were able to put their love of America above their party or even their philosophy, but not their principles, and work together even begrudgingly, but for the greater good, or as I use Burr as an example, were a contributor to the conversation in bad faith. And they all, Hamilton, Adams, and Burr in their own way realized that each of the others, well, Jefferson and Burr and rather Adams and Hamilton, I think never ever, but kind of where they did realize it. You can point to ways where they didn't work it out in all cases, but they recognized the other one was operating in good faith, even though we disagreed in some ways fundamentally. Whereas Burr is the contrast there. So that's the second part. And then the third part is a very quintessentially Jeffersonian idea that of all his changes, all his smoke and mirrors some people have accused him of, and is evolving and changing over the years, something that was consistent throughout was that the earth belongs to the living, not the dead. But then it belongs to the next generation too, so you don't have the right to wreck it for the next ones. Which then means all men are created equal, means you right now are on this. If you put the founders on a pedestal, well, then you better get up there and expose yourself like that too. And if you want to take them off the pedestal, don't put yourself up there. We're on the same level. And that's something that makes him consistent, I think is very inspiring.
So that's, I'm so glad you introduced those words, all men are created equal, that Jefferson is so connected to from the Declaration of Independence. But there is this cognitive dissonance in Jefferson. The guy who writes those words, all men are created equal, as you say to the students, was born a slave owner.
Right.
And he knew it. And he understood that he had made this great principled claim on behalf of the nation, and yet he was not living up to it.
Right.
So how do you square that circle as one of his interpreters?
I love the expression "square the circle." It's such an 18th century Enlightenment expression, and it's perfect for this too.
Perfect for Jefferson.
Love it, though. Part of it is that I don't. It's the Gordian knot, and I'm not going to pull on Alexander the Great and just slash it. Right? I'm not that, and part of it is that I don't, and I think part of it is that I'll start out saying something that I think he also believed. I don't think he, in his best moments, denied that he failed.
Right.
In some ways, and this is one of the ways he failed, and his generation failed. And so I try to, no, I just do. Now I don't pull punches with it, a lot less now than maybe I did before, where I guess one of the things I'll say, it's not a Jefferson quote, but I think it summarizes what I'm doing as an interpreter. And what I'll say is, no man who refuses to acknowledge his failures is worth listening to when he talks about his successes. And so it's one of the things, and this is actually one of the things I had to learn when I was at the International Center for Jefferson Studies, and at the end they asked me to, before, at the very beginning, they asked me to give my fellows forum in character, which changed my whole approach and scared the breeches off of me. That instead of having a nervous breakdown about the night before going to speak to a library full of, the number turned out to be 76 people there. So that was something you can't make up. And all these were scholars and guides at Monticello, and instead of having a nervous breakdown, what I came to the realization was I don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. I don't have to be the master of all this information. I'm here to share a specific technique of examining history, not just of telling the story, but this technique leads you into specific, really unique ways of looking at it where you have to put on the shoes and walk in them literally. And that limits you in some ways and then expands your ability to do things in others. I'm sharing and demonstrating this technique here, and that's the best I can do, in which case then if I don't know the answer to a question, I find ways to say it in character. Oh, I'm 280 years old or whatever, or I didn't write that down. If I didn't write it down, I can't remember it, kind of thing. And I'm not making excuses. People trust you more when you do that. And I've also, over the years, found that if I try too hard to justify Jefferson's ownership of slavery, and you can find text that he wrote, plenty of it, as deeply as you want to double down, to do that kind of thing, you lose faith more in that conversation. Whereas if you start out saying, all right, yep, I failed at this. I can give you a few reasons why. I go through them pretty quickly when I do, because it starts to become excuses, and say, here are places I or he, as Jefferson, succeeded. Here are places his generation as well, failed. Your turn. And then the next step is, and one of the things I do in the shows is a very Jeffersonian thing, which is, okay, now 200 years from now.
Right.
When you, the generation listening to this guy portray Jefferson, nobody's going to praise you 200 years from now because you didn't own slaves. And now this is where I do something, and I thought about this before coming in here, if I was going to mention it. Well, we'll see. I'm going to jump in the pool here. I'm going to do a cannonball with it. But one of the things I'll say is, first I say, bear with me. What I'll say at first won't make any sense, but please bear with me. And I say, the fact that you do not own slaves now does not make you morally superior to someone who was born a slave owner, like me, like Jefferson, in the 18th century. Now, that doesn't make any sense. Why owning slaves is wrong? Jefferson knew it was wrong. They knew that it was wrong by that point, right? So then, why does it not make you better? Because Jefferson was born a slave owner, and he died a slave owner. For you to own a slave, you would have to break the law to own a slave. Doesn't mean slavery doesn't exist. We know that there are more people who are enslaved various ways, human trafficking, that kind of thing in the world now than there were in the 18th century and in the 19th century. But you don't own one. You don't even see them in the world. You might buy a shirt from a sweatshop somewhere. You don't know where it was made, but you can't own them. So you don't own them. You didn't end slavery. There's a generation who fought and bled to end slavery in America. They deserve the accolades. So how will you earn posterity's praise? Because if all you do is go through life saying, well, I don't own slaves, haha, aren't I better than them? You're doing nothing different than the norm for your society, which is what a slave owner in the South was doing. If he was born a slave owner, Jefferson's first memory is being carried on a pillow on the back of a horse by a slave to the home that his family was moving to. That was the norm, not morally defending it, but it was the norm. So if all you do is this thing that's the norm, 200 years from now, no one's going to applaud you for it. What will you do? What are you doing that you can say at the end of your life, here are the things I did for the people who are going to be alive 200 years from now. That's how you earn. So yes, you should judge Jefferson and his generation for the failures and the successes. And to not do so, to explain it away by saying, oh, they were men of their time, that's letting yourself off the hook. Because now I'm just a man of my time. All the things I could say I'm doing that are normal, but that are harmful. Or to say, oh, they were horrible and evil, I'm not going to listen to them. You're letting yourself off the hook. Because what are you doing that's better? So then that hook of what are you going to do for 200 years from now, I think it's a very Jeffersonian twist of the earth belongs to the living also means so does the responsibility.
So, and you really get to one of the things I think is most important in looking at history is this question of moral judgment and how we contextualize and understand whether it's an individual like Jefferson or whether it is a period of how it is different from our own time and what has changed in the in-between. And to your point, the fact that the Civil War happened, slavery was outlawed, we are the beneficiaries of that in that it is simply not a question for us today in the way that it wasn't a question, to your point, for Jefferson, because that was the reality. This is the reality. And that's complex and nuanced, and I think it's one of the things that we struggle with looking backwards, and we have seen it and over the last, particularly the last 5 years or so, how we strike this balance between saying that human chattel slavery was morally wrong. It is a bad thing. It should never have happened. And at the same time say, yet for most of human history, it happened, and it happened in this country. And that doesn't mean that the Declaration of Independence is worthless because it was written by someone who owned slaves. And yet we see that some people want to go to that place to say the founders, at least most of them, other than a couple of them, we don't need to pay any attention to them because they did there were these moral failures, chief amongst them slavery.
I think I want to add a codicil to my rant of a minute ago, and to say that, as a qualifier, to say that I also would be letting Jefferson, and by my logic, myself, off the hook a little bit by saying that he was just a man of his times, by owning slavery. That, yes, when he was born, it was normal. When he was a child, he thought it was normal, but he eventually knew it was wrong. Mm-hmm. He did. And there were people, fewer in the South, but you've got a few examples that are shining examples of people who gave up a lot to make themselves examples to fight against it, though generally they were younger by a generation than Jefferson. So there was pushback, and it wasn't considered to be totally normal. However, I am put right in the middle of this in a way that, well, I've got a conflict of interest, don't I? Here I am.
Sure.
Here I am. And it's my livelihood. But on the other hand, I mentioned it earlier as the metaphor. It's not a metaphor with me when you don't judge someone until you walk a mile in their shoes. Well, I've walked a lot more than a mile in his shoes. And that doesn't mean I'm defending him and everything he did was right. But that does change things. And along with, I haven't seen the current version of the musical, but your analysis of the way the musical and the way certain characters are interpreted, if you're really diving into a character in theater, be it this kind or be it where everything's scripted, no one is the villain in their own story. And if you're playing that person like they believe they're the villain, then it gets boring. It's not interesting, and the best villains are the ones where you kind of, they're seductive. You start to kind of see. So I don't want to be the seductive villain here, but at the same time, you've got to walk a mile in those shoes to portray that character, and that puts me in a certain place. So rather than with that conflict of interest here and tried to defend the importance of Thomas Jefferson for tutting anybody who says, well, because he owned slaves and because of his relationship, qualified as you will with Sally Hemings, therefore we will not respect or listen to him at all. I'll take a different tack. I'll say from a tactical point of view, if you are engaged in constitutional law and those parts of American life that are bound up in it, like civil rights, if you reject everything before the 14th Amendment, you cut your knees out from under you legally, because in law, yes, there's history, but then there's law history. In law, precedent means something. Those are the building blocks. I make a joke in character as Jefferson saying there was nothing original in the Declaration. There wasn't an original idea in the Declaration of Independence. And I say, I'm a lawyer, we do that. People chuckle, but no, that's the strength of it. He was humble enough to know and trained enough as a lawyer to know he got those phrases everybody had hashed out, and the precedents that had become legal and natural law precedents and actual phrases, they were in there. People weren't as likely to dive into a scrum over them and restart a whole new argument. They could vote, okay, we'll vote on that. Great. We all understand, nothing new here. And if you cut out everything in American constitutional history before the 14th Amendment, you are weakening your own argument. Even if your argument is Jefferson is bad, you're weakening yourself by ignoring him. And because of how involved his legacy and the founders' legacy is in the very basis of the constitutional precedent that makes the groundwork for our civil rights cases now.
Well, and I think it speaks loudly to the complexity of humanity, that we are all individually complex. We can do great things and we can do terrible things, and we can do them in the same day, in the same hour, and so
at the same time.
At the same time, exactly, the same act
Right.
seen from two different points of view. So I think, to me, I have been noticing greatly this, that people are unaware or don't acknowledge that a lot of the failings that we see in government, in any institution, often are the human failings of the people who make up those institutions. And I see the founders in very much the same way, that they gave us so much, and we are better off for it today, for what they gave us in the Constitution, and in a Constitution that would that could be changed, and yet they were imperfect. Well, we all are. And that's the interesting thing. So I want to jump to what we tend to talk about at America Today. You do a lot of work with students and teachers and lawyers, and we've talked about that. But I want you to talk a little bit about your experience when you are before students. Now, some of that here is here at Freedom's Foundation.
Right.
You've been coming here a long time as Thomas Jefferson.
I think my first performances here were in 2000.
Okay, yeah. So... yeah, almost 25 years ago, 23 years ago. So that's the beginning of your... but then you're also doing schools here in Philadelphia. I know you've flown out to California to, schools that we have a connection to others. What are you... And I'm asking this in the context of hear about the lack of civic education, national test scores. What's your experience? Because I suspect you may have some mixed experiences, but speak to what you see when you come in as Thomas Jefferson and engage and give them the opportunity to ask you questions, or you're being Socratic and asking them questions. What are you seeing?
There's a mix, and there's a pretty vast difference, I'll say, when you have a self-selected group of students like you have at Freedom's Foundation. They work to get here. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a writing contest or something, but they work to get here. Versus if you go and you perform for the entire middle school or the entire 8th grade, that kind of thing. So once you jump into an entire grade or an entire school, then you get a wide swath of society, and you have extremes. And on one extreme, there are people who just aren't interested. This is all the stuff my teacher says. Mm-hmm. And I fear there's on that extreme, there's been a lot in a conversation nationwide. There's been a big contribution to the conversation nationwide that somehow teachers are they are the enemy almost. They are not connected with daily life, and they are not the things they're teaching you. You just roll your eyes, and that doesn't apply to. Why don't they teach me things in school that really matter? Well, they're trying to, but they're not teaching you how to do your taxes. They're not teaching you how to calculate APR on a credit card, that kind of thing. So why, and in there, there's a shut off from the conversation. However, that if you go away from that extreme, there's also, I see, once you invite students to engage, and I do a lot of this. I work very hard to do this, where once if you can convince them that, or just find a way to allow them to feel like they are welcome, and that, like I said earlier, that the difficult subjects, the ones that are rankling them, but they just can't think of, either they can't think of the right way to ask it, or they think saying anything about it will get them in trouble. Once you find a way to invite that, or have them forget themselves, and just next thing they know, they're participating. And the debate formats do a lot of that. And I've got a couple techniques I use to do that as well, where next thing they know, they can't be cynical teenagers anymore. They're engaging, and they think they're challenging you. And the last thing you want to do is let them know how excited you are that they're challenging you, because then they're not being cool anymore in their minds, right? But once whatever it is that crosses past that threshold that's holding them back, of feeling like they're not welcome, or that the subject matter is not welcome and bad, then they begin to experiment, and yes, to make mistakes in how they word it, or in their knowledge is imperfect, but they begin to, that exploration, the making of mistakes, and the having to learn, have that pushback in that conversation, then it's off to the races. And that's one of the formats I like best about this, where some of it's scripted or prepared remarks, but especially with high school and on, I mix things up more, giving them periodic selected times during the presentation to answer questions and engage, and encouraging them to challenge me. I've seen some amazing back and forth there when they feel, I don't want to say safe because there's pushback, and then other ones, sometimes they get into a debate with each other over Jefferson or Hamilton, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So safe is the wrong word, but then the ones who's challenging the other one feels welcome that they get to do that, which is different than feeling safe, but there's an environment where a civic discussion can happen on not a Pollyanna level of, well, we're marching in lockstep or nobody's being offended. It's like in the 1776 musical, what's John Adams say? This is a revolution, we're going to have to offend somebody. But that there is a way to engage and have difference and challenge and pushback that is productive and that is in good faith. And that happens, this theater technique, in what way I like to use it, and with adults too, it can work.
Sure.
You know, once it's, and with the groups of lawyers is a great example. Once they realize, oh, I mean, they're okay with us asking questions when they don't already know the question's coming, because a lawyer will never do that. You know,
Right.
You don't ask the question you know the answer to. You don't know that, you know. And then it's off to the races, and we barely have time for the rest of our prepared script with the lawyers. You know, so this is a human thing, not just with kids.
And there have been plenty of studies that show, particularly with civic education, that the experiential learning has a deeper impact. It lasts longer. It's more meaningful. And we've certainly seen that with the way that students interact. Here you have done presentations on your own. You've done them with John Adams. You've done them with Alexander Hamilton. You've done them with Abigail Adams. So you're interacting with different historic individuals who Jefferson would have interacted with naturally often. But it is that opportunity when they are something more than an audience that they come alive in what you're describing.
I'll predicate my response to that by referencing something that Annette Gordon-Reed talked about, how for some reason the way she said it really reached me, and that she has a way of saying things that are controversial, but that are just sober and grounded. And basically what she said was, but you do need to know this happened on this date. And
That's
this
right.
Then. You need that. I mean, that
Right.
is a foundation.
You need foundational knowledge,
Right.
but then when you can
Right.
engage that knowledge in an experiential way, that solidifies that knowledge.
They get to
as
jump in.
meaningful. And it's as important as being able to balance your checkbook and understand a loan.
Yeah.
But we don't, too often we give education attempts to give them knowledge without a lot of context. That is, read this, take this test, write this essay, and with just a little bit, whether it's a classroom debate or it's interacting with a historic interpreter or it's going to visit a historic site, we know that all of a sudden that base of that foundational knowledge connected with that experience, all of a sudden it is, 1 + 1 = 3.
Mm-hmm. I've been to situations, I mean, Monticello is one of them, but there have been battlefields too, where I've been to in various homes, that kind of historical homes and historical sites, where that exact epiphany moment happened, where, oh, that's what you meant.
Right.
I mean, it's not American Revolution, it's not founding period, but my interest in history goes a bit, beyond that. And when I was in Farmington, New Mexico earlier this year for a debate with John Adams, went to the Aztec Ruins National Memorial. And I had one of those absolute coalescence moments. First going through the museum setup, and they've got it curated. They were writing about the basket makers and this culture they called the basket makers, and they wove baskets, and it was a big part of their culture. Okay, and I remember thinking, okay, at first that's an interesting way to just refer to a people, but a very archaeologist, anthropologist way to do it. You categorize them that way. But going out and seeing the site, and it was just something about seeing the kiva, this central gathering place, and they had one reconstructed and had a dome roof to it, and reading about it, and the dome roof mimicked the dome of the sky, and also the basket was mimicking the dome of that they make in everyday functioning and in their economy, and also the dome roof of this religious and social space they met was mimicking the dome of the sky. And so their cosmogony and their economy and their social environment were all the same thing. And I remember looking up at the sky, and it's New Mexico, so it's flat in the area I was in. It's from Farmington, all flat, and thinking, oh, basket makers. And I walked in and I was kind of as enthusiastic as I've gotten in some of my rants today with the Rangers, and they loved it about that moment. And I never could have had that, but I stood there at that historical site.
Right.
And it was curated by generations of experts to give me the context. And there were what you could call very primary documents in objects and buildings and things. So the 1, 2, 3 punch of curation and expertise for context, of primary documents, and of the importance of place, all in the same moment. And those 3 things cannot be done by a school. I don't think we should pile more on schools to do all that. We need to realize education is not just to be done during school and then never again.
Absolutely. I was privileged to be asked to write a piece on the challenges of civic education for the ABA, who you work a lot with, and different bar associations. And I basically closed the piece by talking about how we all need to be civic educators, that it is not simply a matter of one more thing schools need to do, because we have just piled one thing on top of another over the last 40 years of you need to teach this and teach this and teach this. And yes, they need to teach civics and they need to teach history, but I think when our country was better at civic education, it was when there were these reinforcing institutions, whether they were scouting or church or sports leagues or whatever, where there were these lessons and there was the reinforcing experiences of that did not. We did not require that the only place civic education was going to happen was in school.
I wonder, I think you and I have been wondering, and we've had conversations offline, as they say, plenty of times about this diaspora, perhaps from a unifying principle. You've said the reason for naming the podcast after George Washington was because of the unifying figure that he was in so many ways. And even Jefferson said, when he's convincing Washington to come back for that second term, North and South will hang together if they have you to hang on to.
That's right.
And yes, there was an East and West conflict, but Jefferson named it. There was North and South too, and they could hang on to Washington. And I wonder, especially over the last couple of years, if what we're seeing is not a breaking apart, but we're seeing new civic sites and new historical sites that can be, we see a whole new national holiday that we haven't fully defined yet. We haven't really found our footing with it yet, right? But so many things that, like that, it takes a while. That, yes, we're in a moment of destabilization, but the strength and the weakness of any government by the people, and certainly one that mixes in elements of democracy, is the unstable nature. Yes, that means it can break apart, but also it can adapt and react and not just stick to something that worked 1,000 years ago but doesn't work anymore.
Right, absolutely. And again, it brings us back to these institutions are human institutions made up of people, and people change their mind, and the things that made sense 50 years ago may not make sense anymore, but new things, new paradigms can replace them. I want to bring us back before we get to the quiz to one last thing, and that is Jefferson's friendship with Adams, the 1800 election. We are, going to be coming into a new presidential election.
Are we? I hadn't heard of it.
I know that not a word, not a word. But I'm curious if you think, because you and I know, lots of our listeners know that the Jefferson Adams election, both of them were guys who were friends who then, were no longer friends for many, many years because of the election.
They wouldn't admit that, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there are, so I think it speaks to the politics has always been rough and tumble in this country. It has always been polarizing. And there are some particular elections that we can point to. Certainly the one that gets kicked into the House of Representatives that Jefferson eventually wins because Hamilton supports him. What
Jefferson's turning over in his grave that Hamilton's getting so much credit for that. You won. I get that question. You won because of what do you feel about the fact that Hamilton made you win?
That's right. It was really Henry Clay, but yeah. But do you think there's a lesson there, for us as we sort of do the hair on fire coming into another presidential election?
I've seen some flaming hats already. Yes, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, though this is not a program I get to do here at Freedoms Foundation a lot, just because of the specific nature of what I'm working with the students on here. But it's been the preoccupation of my most recent solo piece that I've been developing for the last number of years is based on the election of 1800. And when I've mentioned the themes of it going along here. And I think that, it was every bit the constitutional crisis, every bit the bordering on civil war, in 1800, early 1801, militias in Pennsylvania and Virginia were called out by the governors. It almost wasn't, and this was the first transition of power from one party to another party. Right. Though they wouldn't admit that either. Right. But it was, the first transition of power from Washington to Adams was extremely important and not to be downplayed, but this was the first from one political party to another. And the whole world thought, oh, well, this is it. And they had a good reason to think that. Here's the lesson I've been drawing from it and working on ways to draw from it. And I've worked on parting from it being a fairy tale of can't we all just get along? And I think a simplistic admonition of, well, we have to respect the people on the other side, and there are two sides of every argument, and that, I think, doesn't go far enough. And I think, so I use Adams, Hamilton, and Burr as this triumvirate to get away from the I think is probably a false, I'll call it false binary of there being two sides to every discussion, even if you simplify it to be functional. There are really three sides, and Hamilton and Adams represent two sides. If you are Jefferson, and these are people I disagree with, and the one is Adams represents family and friends, but you disagree with them, and the other represents people that are never going to be your friend. You don't like them. That's the Hamilton
right. It's
metaphor.
the work colleague.
Right.
You've got to work with them, but
right. In America, well, they're here, but you don't even like them. You don't even want to be in a room with them, and they're not family or friends. And so those two, in a sense, I've been working on for the last 20 years or so, because first I started out going all over the country with debates with Alexander Hamilton, then switched over much more to John Adams. And so worked through those. But in both those situations, in their own way, Adams and Hamilton helped get through that crisis. Adams, and this sounds like an insult every time I say it, I get a laugh from the audience, but the greatest thing he ever did was to avoid a crisis in the 1800 election, he went home. Now that sounds like an insult. It wasn't. It was a crisis. He could have stayed. He could have ridden the whirlwind, another expression they like to use. He could have used the chaos. He held the reins of power still. It didn't cross his mind. Because you know Adams so well, you studied him. We know it didn't cross. He would have written it down. He wrote everything down. Right. This is a man, the dog that didn't bark is a big deal for the writings of John Adams. He wrote everything. And it wouldn't have occurred to him because he had such principles and such virtue and such honesty that is almost impossible, especially to reach that high in politics. He went home peacefully. So we grump at him for not staying for the inauguration. He's a hero. The greatest things George Washington ever did were the 2 times he went home. Voluntarily surrendering his commission as general. Right. Voluntarily leaving at the end of the second term when he was, maybe he would have died in office if things would have turned out the same, and that would have been a precedent. So that Cincinnatus example was the impossible example. So then Hamilton, what did he do? He, in turning to his colleagues and saying, basically, Jefferson's principles may be misguided, but at least he has them. Burr has none. At least Jefferson has, I think one of the near quotes is, at least Jefferson has pretensions to character. It's close as he could get. It's a backhanded compliment, but he did say, but Burr has none. Burr is completely bankrupt except in the plunder of his country. And if he gains this office, he will never leave. Hamilton called it. He saw we couldn't handle. And so the comparison I use is you have the two good faith contributors to the conversation with whom you fundamentally, some cases violently, as those cabinet meetings Jefferson described with Hamilton as being descending daily into the pit like a gladiator. You fundamentally disagree and you don't even like them. But Jefferson came to realize Hamilton was engaging in good faith, even said so.
Right.
That he was honest in his public dealings. And we saw in Jefferson's presidency that he took on some of Hamilton's that was less against commerce, less against industry, pushed for home industry, American manufacturing, because he saw it could help us. And that Louisiana Purchase, very Hamiltonian. And Hamilton lived long enough to gloat about that a little bit. So I don't use the room where it happened deal. I think it's too Pollyanna, and Jefferson later regretted it because it set up the banks. But the later Jefferson moved in his direction. Adams and Jefferson also. They didn't just stop talking about politics and become friends and just not. No, they talked about it. They hashed through it.
Yeah.
So those are the examples that are positive. And who's the fly in the ointment that I think breaks the false binary that becomes a fairy tale? Can't we just all get along or have civil conversations? You have to find those people that you disagree with but are in good faith. The Hamiltons and the Adams in your life, because there are the Aarons Burr. And if you can't find in your life the ones you fundamentally disagree with, either they're family and friends or that you just don't like them, but you have to realize, oh, no, they love America. They just disagree on the best way to protect it. If you can't find them, that's on you, I think. And you've got to do some soul searching.
That is just a really wonderful way for us to end, because I think that gives us something to think about, that there are so many people out there that we can fundamentally disagree with, but if we are honest and true, we are able to say, much the way Hamilton said of Jefferson, never agreed with him once, he loves the country.
He's wrong, but he wants to be right. He's trying to be right, as opposed to
He's
Aaron
not
Burr.
absolutely burn it all down.
Aaron Burr just wanted to get power.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's wrap this up with our quiz. No study necessary. Here we go. Excluding Washington and Lincoln, who's your favorite president?
I will self-recuse Jefferson.
I was wondering if you might.
Because of a conflict of interest. We'll
Seems
just call
like
it a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say Adams, and it's because of what I said.
Oh, I love that.
He's so under the going home.
Yeah.
It never even occurred to him. And that permeates his struggle with Washington's cabinet and all that, his struggle. He was the first. If we had someone less than Adams for that, would he had to be the guy that followed Washington?
Yeah.
That would have been it.
Yeah.
A lesser man would have been crushed under that.
Okay. What's one thing you would want every American to learn more about?
I would say the difference between anecdote and data. That data is not the plural of anecdote and what all that implies.
Interesting. Okay. If you had not chosen a career as an actor, what do you think you might have become?
When I was a kid, I wanted to be a lawyer. That's what my parents were so encouraging me to go to Dickinson.
So now you play one on TV.
I play one on TV. Whether or not that was a good decision or not is still, the book's still open on that.
Let's see. What pet peeve annoys you the most?
Over packaging. When you buy something and it's hermetically sealed and you need a saw and a hammer and a chisel just to get the thing out of
it's a pair of pliers.
Makes
because
me
you
nuts.
can't.
And it's petty, so it's a pet peeve.
Yeah.
Like, man.
Love it. What's one thing you think most people would be surprised to learn about you?
One thing that most people would be surprised to learn about me. Well, because I make my living with words, and it's as Shakespeare, as well as Tom Stoppard said, they're all we have to go on. So I would say that I'm terrible at Scrabble. I'm just embarrassingly, I am awful. An hour and I spell the.
Right. You just don't have the recall for the big.
I think it's a different side of the brain. It's you use words for meaning. This is words as math, and that's just not.
Yeah, it's not that you don't know the words. It's just that
I'm off. It's horrible. It's just.
If you could meet just one historical person, who would it be?
Again, I'm not going to say Jefferson, but not because of self-recusal, but because I wouldn't learn anything important about him. I'd be charmed for an entire dinner we had together, and by the end I'd realize I'd learned nothing about him because he was good at that.
But at least you'd be drunk on really good French wine.
I would get to drink some wine I can't afford. I would say, though, maybe one of his granddaughters, like Cornelia or Ellen, or something, because what now the National Archives and with ICJS and these other institutions are doing with the Founders Online and with the Jefferson Papers is that Jefferson Papers are beginning to go through the letters that his granddaughters would write to each other when he would bring one to Poplar Forest, another one stay at Monticello, and they would spy on Grandpapa.
Oh.
And they would gossip about him. They spilled the beans. Where you're starting to learn things about him that he kept deep undercover about his feelings. Like John Adams would write about all that stuff.
Sure.
And so maybe this is predicated on they would actually talk to me.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be a stranger. They'd open up.
No, absolutely.
I think they'd spill the beans and I'd learn a lot of nuance and insight about Jefferson that he would never want me to know, but they would say, "Ooh, let me tell you." And I'd learn
that's fascinating. I love it. Okay, final question, bourbon or scotch?
A couple of years ago, I would have said scotch without a blink. But for some reason over the last few years, for reasons of their own, people have been giving me bottles of the various iterations of Jefferson's Kentucky bourbon.
Yep.
No idea why. They just do.
I don't know.
And it's a cliche, but I'm developing a taste for it. So now going more in a direction of bourbon.
Yeah. Jefferson's is definitely a great one.
Yeah.
So. Okay. Well, thanks to our guest, Steve Edenbo. Can't wait to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me.
I also want to thank our producer, Laura Kennedy and Sarah Rasmussen, and a special shout out to friend of the pod, Bill Franz, for his art design on the logo. Special thanks to longtime Freedom's Foundation and AHT historic interpreter Bob Gleason for his contributions at the beginning, for the intro music, and most of all, I want to thank all of you, our listeners. Please subscribe, follow, rate, and review George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to your podcasts, and please tell your friends. If you want to learn more about Freedom's Foundation, you can visit us at www.freedomsfoundation.org and follow us on social media or email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with your comments, questions, or suggestions. Have a great week.